You spend 30 years building your wealth, you hit your number, and you retire. And when you check your mutual fund and you see the balance going up, everything feels perfectly fine. But honestly, that feeling is an illusion. So in this video, we're going to expose this problem by showing you one of the most popular mutual funds in the world, a fund you might own right now, so you can keep more of what you've earned. As wealth managers here at Ironwood, helping successful investors protect their wealth so they can actually enjoy it is what Alex and I do every day.
Yeah, and just the other day, we were talking to a guy in this exact same boat. He thought he was doing great. He loved his main mutual fund. But then we ran the numbers we're about to show you. And we had to show him what he left on the table over the last 10 years. It was almost $1 million just because his portfolio felt right.
Yeah, and now anyone holding a traditional mutual fund is going to be surprised at how much money might be left on the table. Because if you look at your account balance going up and you assume you're doing fine, you're falling for what's called outcome bias. And it blinds you to what potentially could be hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost growth. And the other day, I was actually on Reddit and I was researching the Contra Fund because this is one of the funds we actually researched for this show. And the performance was staggeringly different over the last 10 years. But then right on Reddit, someone says, oh, I love that I've been holding the Contra Fund. It's been performing really well for me. It's taking care of my retirement. And I go, that's exactly the issue. That's the problem that people need to start looking at is, yes, it feels right when you look at your statement, but the reality is that he left a lot of money on the table over that same time frame.
Yeah, that's the problem we run across, which is individual investors are generally a sample size of one. You don't talk to anyone else about your portfolio, at least not in detail. You know, as opposed to picking on Fidelity and the Contra Fund, we're going to pick on American funds and specifically the Growth Fund of America. One of the most popular funds out there. They've been around forever. They're huge, hundreds of billions of dollars. And how have they done over the last 10 years? So what we did is we compared them to an ETF. And the ETF I picked, I'm not saying this is a great ETF by it. I just picked one that's similarly invested. If you look at the chart, the first thing you get is sticker shock. You're like, whoa, 375% versus 116% over 10 years. That can't be right.
Yeah, that's insane because that's the difference. If you look at the pure numbers, if you had invested $1 million 10 years ago, that's 4.75 million or 2.16. Like that's, like nearly $2.5 million. It's insane. Like that type of difference, it's a gut punch if you were actually holding that fund. And like, we gotta go further into this. The whole point of this is that you just can't look at the balance and think it's good enough. And it can just be a gut punch. Like, what am I doing? How is this so different? And it just starts here. Like, this is why you have to start looking under the hood.
The next question I had was, okay, is this really a fair comparison? Are they actually buying the same stuff? So we looked at the holdings. We've got NVIDIA, Broadcom, Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Tesla. That's the Growth Fund. The ETF I picked was NVIDIA, Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, Broadcom, Meta, Google. I mean, it's the same stuff, okay? And, again, we didn't just pick any old mutual fund. This is a big one out there. So this should be a fair comparison. So what is causing this big difference?
Yeah, and that's why you just can't look at your rising balance and assume, oh, it's good enough, I'm doing well. Because the mutual fund wrapper, and we're going to dive into this more, can actually drag you down. So that raises a question, right? If they own the same things, how is it so different? How is it 375% versus 116? Where does that actually go? So to answer that, we have to look at distributions. Because if you only look at the price chart, you're actually getting a fake picture of your wealth and missing the true costs of holding these funds because it is so much more complex than that.
Went over to Morningstar, another well-respected, source in the finance industry, and they're showing a much smaller difference. They're only showing about an 80% difference between these two funds over a 10-year period. But it's still, if we started with $1 million, that's still $800,000.
Yeah, $800,000 is still a lot of money, a lot of income in retirement, and a lot of security for people. That's huge.
And what Morningstar is counting that Yahoo Finance isn't counting are the capital gains distributions that the mutual fund makes every year. So let's go over to the Growth Fund America's website and look at their capital gains distributions over the last 10 years or so. What we see is that they're actually pretty sizable. Okay, so if you look at these capital gains distributions, I'm going to go kind of in general generic percentages. $2.50 on $42, we're talking about a 6% distribution. The next year, we've got about a 6.5% distribution. The next year, we've got over a 10% distribution, back to 6. But these are sizable distributions. We go back to, last year's distribution, over 10% again. And so what that means is they're kicking out money that you have to pay taxes on every year. So use the 2025 example. They kicked out just over 10% of the portfolio in capital gains. What does that mean? Well, if you're in the standard capital gains rates, you've got to pay about 20% tax on that to the feds, right? So if they kicked out 10, you got to pay 2. That's almost like having an extra 2% expense ratio.
Yeah, it's just a huge drag on the portfolio if you're in a taxable account, 100%.
And if you go back to that 80% difference on the Morningstar, that's not counting taxes. So that's assuming we fully reinvest these distributions and we pay no taxes on them. Then you only get an 80% difference. But if you actually pay taxes on it, it would be far greater.
Just based on Morningstar data, then it's still $800,000 difference over 10 years. That's too much. Like, you have to look at your investments. You have to know what you're holding because of this. This is why we're making this video. But if you're in a taxable account, that difference could be way greater. You're talking... it could be another $1 million. It could be 500,000, depending on what your tax situation is and how you're in these accounts. So now the difference just got even worse. So that's why we keep saying, look under the hood.
What I'd like to point out, this was particularly bad in 2008, but we saw this again in 2022, was if we look at this fund, started the year of 2022, or it ended the year of 2021 at around $71 a share. It ended the year, the following year, at $50 a share. So it lost about a third of its value. Okay, that's a bummer all in itself, right? But then it kicked out a capital gain of another 4%. So now you're paying taxes on your loss. So that's just insult to injury.
And then you have money going out at the worst time possible. You're literally in a down market. You're trying to have a secure retirement, and you're adding salt to the wound. So that 20% tax rate, it just makes the number so much larger. And the worst part is you have no control over these tax decisions. But it's not just the tax bill dragging you down. We have to cover that it's also the way the company is managing the money. You're paying a premium fee for an active manager to make all these decisions. It's always costing you money. It just blows me away that I don't understand why this is still such a popular fund with billions invested into it.
So it's not just American funds. Let's talk about another manager, Cathie Woods. She's one of the more famous investors to come out in the last 10 years or so. I certainly had never heard of her before 2020. And then what happened? 2020, we had COVID, and boom, she just guessed everything right. Okay, so I did the same comparison looking from 2019 through the beginning of 2022. And what we see is she took a portfolio up 200% in like 2 years, right? And the category average didn't do bad either. It was about 45%, or not the category average, but the ETF I've been using. So still, amazingly different, right? She did absolutely phenomenal. The problem is, what happens if you zoom out even further? Okay, and so we did that. So here we have roughly 10 years. And we see that, okay, while she did phenomenally in 2020 and 2021, it just absolutely collapsed during 2022 and 2023. And if you go back to that ETF that we were comparing it to, it was lagging way behind, but over the 10-year period, it still ended up beating her by almost 60%.
Yeah, and the one thing that scares me too about seeing this graph, Alex, is that if you were there along for the ride during COVID and you had that huge 200 plus, increase, that's great. But then you came back to reality. You basically lost it all back to normal. But then it's the people that got into that fund chasing that performance. That's what scares me, because if you look from there on, that's where it gets really bad.
Yeah, I just did April of 21 through June of 26, and you would have lost almost 40%. So you get into that fund right when you hear about it. Like, oh my gosh, this lady's a genius. She's killing it. Let me get in, and boom, you just lost 40% over the next 5 years, whereas everyone else made almost 100.
So when you look at that, it's obviously, to us, having an active manager is such a huge risk because of these disparities in market performance versus the average. So that's why the next thing we have to look at, so you really understand that where these active managers fall, is the category average.
Right. So we'll go back to American funds, same fund we've been picking on. And they did, over 10 years, growth of 10 years at 44,000. And the category average did worse. So that did pretty well, right? The category average only got to 41,000. But the index, which again is going to be similar to an ETF in this example, did 51. So we're talking about, 41 to 51. That is a 25% difference over category average. So if you don't believe you can pick the best mutual fund manager out there and you're just going to get an average one, we're talking a 25% difference, just on simple throwing darts.
Well, and category average for the people listening is it's basically taking every active mutual fund manager out there and averaging their performance. So you can just see it seems like American Funds is doing great. And that's the story they may tell you. But then you compare it to the index or a simple ETF and it just doesn't make any sense anymore. And that's why you have to look under the hood. But the other problem is the variation on the different categories, like how much they underperform or overperform. They're always up and down in this huge cycle.
Yeah, and that's kind of a fun one I heard a long time ago, which is if you take an active manager who's in the top 25% of active managers out there, what are the odds they're in the top 50 next year? So if they're the best of the best this year, what are the chances they're in the top half or bottom half next year? And the answer is right around 50%. And you can see that here. So they went in 2016, they were in the top 25%. And then they went to the third quartile, fourth quartile, second quartile, third, first. So it took them, a 10-year difference basically before they were in the top 25%, only twice, right? And if you look at how many times they were in the top half, it was only 3 times out of 10 years, and that's enough to make them better than the average.
That's where it gets insane. It's mind-boggling. And so much money. And this is the story I want people to understand. Your retirement is on the line. Everything you've worked for your entire life, you're putting in the hands of someone else to invest your money for you, to plan for your future, to make sure you have enough income. And when you see these numbers and you see the difference between active and passive, or in an ETF specifically, not just in a fund, it's really hard to even consider active management anymore. It really is.
Yeah. And the expenses and the capital gains and all that.
Yeah, it's just too much of a weight. So between the capital gains taxes and active management, you can see plain as day, you can't just look at a rising account balance because it's an illusion. But there's a fourth factor we haven't even touched on yet, and it has nothing to do with taxes, active management, or reinvestment. It's actually the way these mutual funds are forced to do business by law that can absolutely take your performance. So check out this video next, where we expose the biggest danger lurking in your mutual fund that nobody is talking about.